Sinners by Ralph Rainwater, Jr., originally published in Masques 3, a compilation of original unpublished horror fiction, edited by J.N. Williamson and published originally in hardcover in 1989. Read by the author. I'd always admired the way David wedded intellect with action, but this latest terrorism went too far. Riding our bikes through the quiet back roads of the Georgian countryside, once again I gathered my courage and told him so. "Listen," he replied, "you're like a broken record. You keep repeating the same old doubts, yet you never convince me they're justified." "That's not fair," I argued. "You know that. Even when I'm right, you always win our arguments." "Then you should learn to debate better. In any case, if you don't like what we, and I emphasize that we, are going to do, why are you pedaling alongside me now?" "Because you're my older brother," I said simply. Given our rough family history, I knew this answer would soften him. In the dark separating us, I saw him nod, and I sensed the smile on David's face. "Okay, then, because you're my younger brother, I'll try to explain one more time." He paused for a moment to collect his thoughts. In the silence, the only sounds we heard in the still, humid night were those of our bikes rolling over the crumbling country road, and of millions of crickets singing their mating songs. With no moon overhead, the weak headlights on our handlebars illuminated only a few feet of ground at a time, barely giving us enough opportunity to swerve around the abundant potholes and occasional crushed animals. The canvas bag, containing a plastic human skeleton David had ordered from a novelty horror catalog, hung around his neck, resting on his back. Also inside the bag were several accessories: a claw-toothed hammer, some nails, and 3 pre-cut lengths of rope, in case pounding in nails proved too loud or difficult. Finally he spoke again. "We're agreed that this whole area is stuck in the past by willful ignorance, right?" "Right." "And the biggest holdback keeping these rural people from joining the 20th century is their primitive brand of religion." "Okay," I said. "So it follows, then, that anything done to discredit religion is good. Think of what our little book did." By our book, he meant the parody of the New Testament he'd written, the Breeder's Digest Condensed New Testament, in which all the human characters had been replaced by dogs. I had merely provided a few ideas and helped distribute it by leaving copies in strategic points around town, at night, of course. The parody, printed on our home computer, created a stir that lasted for weeks. The local paper had been filled with letters from ardent churchgoers and civic leaders, expressing outrage and shock. I'd had doubts at first about belittling a holy book, but we bathed in private glory over the vehement reactions our parody's anonymous authors had caused. The faithful had revealed their insecurity, just as David predicted they would. "Yeah, you were right that time. But isn't this going to extremes?" I asked. "Yes, it is. But no more extreme than these fanatics are. It's an eye for an eye, Mark. We're talking about nailing a skeleton to their cross. They'll go nuts." "Maybe not. Consider what their fanaticism is based on. That they've seen God. He lives amongst them, inside their church." He paused, waiting for a comment. When I offered none, David continued, "Think. Who could believe such a fiction? Only the most ignorant, the poorest types. And that's precisely who belong to this country church. You've seen them around town. You know what the congregation is like. That freak this morning is a perfect example." I didn't want to think about him. There had been too much weirdness to that skinny, ill-dressed man's manner as he exhorted everyone in the town square to join the church of an angry God. There had been an unnatural gleam in his eye, a too frenzied spinning of his arms. He kept shouting, "Praise God! He has come to step on those who've stepped on us. Vengeance is his." "Well then, if they're not going to get violent, what do you think will happen?" I demanded. "Imagine all these zealots coming to worship tomorrow." My brother sounded excited now. "These are people who save welfare checks to buy Cadillacs. That car is a sacred symbol of the good life to them. It's a religious token. And then, with their perpetually pre-scientific minds, they enter the church and stare at their cross. Instead of imagining Jesus, this thing will be up there, a skeleton, signifying how dead their religion really is. Can't you hear them now?" David went on. "Oh, Lordy, Lordy, someone's come in here and done the devil's work. Don't you see? If we pull this off, the congregation will think that God would never have allowed such a transgression." "So he was never there at all," I nodded, understanding. "Exactly," David replied. "Don't you think this little joke is worth it to end such fanaticism?" No, I didn't. David's escapades had always been contrary to my nature. His intellect was somehow too sharp. His condemnation of others' blindnesses too unforgiving. I didn't have the courage of his convictions. Yet here again I was acquiescing to his plans, a faithful though doubting sidekick. Why? Because David was the only person in our atavistic town I could conceivably admire. Because we were both sharp, and all I saw around us were blunt, dull surfaces. Because where my brother went, I had to follow. It was as simple as that. By now our peddling had taken us to an impoverished backwater area, nearly 15 miles from town. Scattered here and there were ramshackle, decaying homes occupied primarily by unemployed, or at best, seasonably employed, poor families. By the light of day, the homes were embarrassments, eyesores. Front porches sagged, roofs had holes, broken windows had newspaper covering them. In the yard round each of these shacks lay assorted garbage and the wrecks of old Cadillacs. Anybody driving through this part of the country during sunset usually spotted the massive families economically clutched by sitting together on rusted chairs or splintering steps. The adults would be smoking, the children chatting. Having until recently given up on prosperity in this life, these people clung to the promise of reward in the next, with a peasant's simple faith in reward and retribution from a personal God. Not for them was God some abstract deity who, if he existed at all, did so as a mass of disincorporated energy. To them, God was an angry old white man with a long beard who'd never forgiven people for killing his son. They awaited the sound of his massive feet stomping across the land, an all-powerful giant who'd set things right. For the past month, their message had been this: the wait was over. And sitting in the midst of this poverty, the nucleus around which every one of these families revolved was the church. We saw its square, whitewashed outline beckoning to us from out of the darkness when we approached. We hid our bikes in some kudzu growth a few yards from the front entrance. The entire area was deserted, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that somebody was watching us. I mentioned this to David. He shrugged it off. We'd been prepared to break a window and climb in if need be, but the front door's knob turned easily. We slipped quietly into the empty church, David carrying our sack of goodies. At first, there seemed nothing unusual. There were the expected polished pews, the imitation stained glass windows, the podium sitting on a dais in front. We were, however, surprised to see a lifelike representation of the crucified Christ on the large oak cross behind the podium. Fundamentalist churches tend not to believe in such graphic depictions. They smack of graven images. It was when we neared the cross that another oddity struck home with me. Unlike most such figures, where Jesus' head is down and his eyes closed, this one's head remained erect, his eyes open. Even more disconcerting was the unmistakable sneer his lips were set in. "How fitting," David said. "Fitting? It's downright scary," I said. "Well, at least we know for sure what this church is about," he replied and walked steadily forward. He stopped when he realized I had not followed. "This statue's likely to be heavy. I'll need your help in taking it down." I couldn't pull my gaze from Jesus' eyes. Whoever had painted them had given the sculpting an almost sentient quality. "I've really got the creeps from this," I admitted. "It truly looks like he's watching us." David frowned. "Sometimes, Mark, you show yourself to be yet a child. Hurry now. It does us no good to waste time chatting. The real danger is that of late-night worshippers dropping by." The idea of fanatics catching us in the act of desecrating their church scared me enough to rush to David's side and hold the bag open for him. While he busied himself trying to yank out a large nail pounded through the left hand, I stared at the front door, nervously expecting it to fly open any second with a contingent of pitchfork-carrying parishioners intending to skewer us. "This might take a bit longer than I'd planned," David said ruminatively. "The nails are pounded flush with the plaster, so I'll have to dig into the statue itself to get a grip on the nail head. I managed to nod. A minute later, when David spoke again, there was something foreign in his voice, uncertainty. "Mark, look at this." I looked. Where David had chipped away the plaster, it was not a chalky white, but blood red. "These people go to some lengths for realism, huh?" He smiled, composure outwardly restored. "Want to bet it bleeds when I pull this nail out?" I shook my head. "David, don't do it." "I was only joking," David said. Grabbing the thick nail with the hammer's claws, he pulled. The nail moved perhaps a half-inch. He tugged again. This time it slid out nearly all the way, and a thin stream of blood followed. It trickled steadily from the wound onto the dais floor. "Oh, shit," David said. I didn't say anything, because my feet were flying up the carpeted aisle, taking me outside toward the bikes. If David was stupid enough to continue this stunt, I thought he'd have to do it alone. He wasn't stupid, however. He was never that. His feet pounded close behind me. I tried to turn the doorknob to leave in one smooth motion, but it was locked now, and momentum caused me to smack hard into the heavy wood and bounce off. By the time I'd regained my feet, David was already rattling the door, frantically. Still, it refused to open. The tinkle of metal striking the floor caused both of us to spin around. What I saw literally made me pee my pants. The statue's head twisted back and forth, as if stretching its neck muscles. Its mouth changed from a sneer into a chilling, mean smile. Its arms and legs flexed plaster muscles, causing the nails binding them to pop out. I heard myself screaming incoherently. Even though he surely was as frightened as I, David kept his wits enough to speak. "Get away from us. I'll knock your goddamn head off," he yelled, still clutching the hammer in his white-knuckled hand. Hesitantly, as if not entirely confident of its balance, the statue took one single step forward. When it began to speak, however, its voice seemed to come from the church itself, not the plaster-filled mouth. It was an appropriately deep voice, filled with authority and menace. "By the depth of their hatred did they create me. By their need for revenge against the fortunate, the well-constituted, did my suffering children cause me to be. I was created in their image. Their faith sustains me." While he spoke, he moved steadily forward, arms outstretched in a welcoming embrace. When the figure was some 10 feet distant, David threw the hammer at it with all his youthful strength. It struck, bounced off, taking a chunk of dark red plaster with it. The statue paid no heed. "I am yet but a weak god. My children are few and simple of intellect. I need an anger fed by knowledge." The head veered toward my brother. "I need you," it said, and stared directly at David. My brother scooped me up with a brave vigor born of hysteria and charged toward the nearest window. Numb of mind, I did nothing to resist. An instant later, amid shards of broken glass, I landed on the grass outside. Somehow I escaped with only a few cuts. But I was alone. I leapt to my feet, ran to the window, and then discovered why David had not followed. The god had him. My brother was locked in his embrace. Before my eyes, I saw the impossible. David, struggling in horror, but then his body began to take on an ethereal quality. Then, quite slowly, gradually, inexorably, it started to merge with the gods, until they were one. Since David's back was to me, thankfully, I did not have to see the incalculable terror that must have been reflected in his young face. Then they were gone. Shock and adrenaline gave me the energy to pedal madly back home. An hour and a half later, I returned to the church with my disbelieving and disgruntled mother, her newest boyfriend, Max, and a very dubious, irascible policeman in tow. They found nothing to corroborate my story. The statue was back in place, head down and eyes closed. The window had been repaired. Even the shards of glass on the ground were gone, as were David's bike and the bag he'd carried inside the church. They all thought David had run off and that I'd used his disappearance to concoct this wild story, trying to explain away the trouble I'd obviously been in. What none of them noticed, and I did not point out, however, was this. Embodied in the statue's face, David's own features could still be discerned. indelibly frozen in a grimace of awful terror.